Hi, my name is Franco Tonelli, and this is the Science of Singing. Today in our program, I'd like to cover covered sound. Let's take, for example, three types of sounds. White sound, covered sound, open throat sound. What's the difference? But first, we need to go to the history. History may give us the understanding of why this term is so confusing. In the 19th century, there was an attempt to really sing full voice with connection on the top with the chest voice. A very famous tenor Dupré experimented with his voice and eventually lost it because of that. Let's examine this without prejudice. Caruso was using open throat technique with a perfect appoggio. It was some kind of confusion in his own understanding how he does it. But you can clearly see, or rather hear, when Caruso sings, there is, to my money, open throat and perfect support technique. The confusion comes from Caruso's proposing this exercise of the covered sounds when A turns into O and eventually into U, which helps people to support the voice on the very difficult passaggio register. Later on it was translated as a must or even the tool to approach this passaggio register. Some singers really did it right. So one of the really successful tenors and singers who used open throat Caruso type technique was Beniamino Gigli. And then later on this technique was more and more accepted. Luciano Pavarotti, who uses the same open throat technique. Now, Luciano Pavarotti is an excellent demonstration here on YouTube of the covered sound. You can check it out. It's just called Pavarotti covered sound. But to my opinion, he uses open throat technique, not covered sound. But he calls it covered sound. Well, why Pavarotti calls it covered sound if it's open throat sound? Let's talk about tradition. That's a tradition that even Caruso talked about covered sound that made people think that the covered sound is the way to technique of modifying vowels. So modification of the vowels when you sing higher seems to be a must. Even when we hear Caruso, our great singers, we hear that the top and high notes are a little bit more dark. You see, we don't hear much of the modification, but we hear the top notes starting from passaggio are getting a little darker. And so that gives us an idea of that we have to do something with our passaggio. But then introducing the term covered and modification of the vowel really confuses us, because it's not actually the way it was presented by Caruso. And it's interesting historically that the only tenor who realized that was Beniamino Gigli. Beniamino Gigli realized that he is not using so-called covered sound, but he used an open throat sound, mentioning, I use open throat sound, I quote Gigli, but I can do it because I use perfect support, he says. So you see, but the same thing was done by not only Beniamino Gigli, but by great Caruso. But he was calling it a covered sound. So the terminology comes out of confusion, out of tradition, and it might do a good job to one student and confuse another. We need to really clarify what's the difference. The demonstration of these types of sound as white and open throat with perfect support is probably the most interesting thing that you can hear on YouTube of Luciano Pavarotti's covered sound. But the confusion is still there, because Pavarotti is using open throat sound with the perfect support like Gili used and Enrico Caruso used, but he calls it a covered sound. So for some singers it may be very confusing. The term itself, covered, kind of implements modification of the vowels. Let me define as clearly as I can what is covered sound. So covered sound is the technique that uses modification of the vowels. Modification from more open vowel to darker vowel, like in case of I showed you A, O, U, in order to balance support. If we don't use that, our voice will break. So the technique of the covered sound to my opinion, is misunderstanding of the perfect technique that was used by Enrico Caruso and some of the singers who mastered that. The misunderstanding was actually, it's a contribution to Caruso himself, who misrepresented his sounds and his technique as somehow that he was using so-called covering technique. Caruso proposed an exercise that helps singers to eliminate unnecessary tension and have a great support on higher notes, especially passaggio. And so this exercise is using the modified vowel when you go to the top. So the exercise that Caruso proposes is changing slowly from A to O and to U, or in Italian, A, O, U. You see what happens here. This sound is very secure in terms of the support, so vocal cords do not experience excessive tension, but you obviously modify them from the A to O and U, which creates some kind of sensation of passaggio. I'm not against traditions. If tradition leads towards right understanding, it's okay. Covered sound is a confusing term, and that's why I decided to make it clear to you the difference between white covered and open throat sounds. I can feel my vocal cords when I'm singing. Why do I feel my vocal cords? Because my vocal cords experiencing unnecessary pressure. And so I will have no choice. If I use this time, if I'm a tenor, for example, I'm using this white sound, really abuse my voice, but at a certain point I still have to cover it or use open throat sound. High we can go with this open white sound. And now A flat. It's more difficult and more difficult. Say A, my throat gets really strangled. Yes, and so will yours. So that kind of sound is only limited by very soft singing and used by some lyric voices, some beautifully. Open throat sound is the technique that eliminates sensations of passaggio. The technique that was used successfully by Pavarotti, technique that was used successfully by Enrico Caruso, by Beniamino Gili and Jussi Björling,